Hi, Peter. Welcome to the show.
Hey, John, thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure. I was looking through your work. I know we're going to be talking about a series that you're in the midst of writing. You've written two books in that series, and my understanding is you're going to have more to come. And we'll certainly get to that. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do for a living, and how you got to the point where you are writing books?
Sure. Well, I'm actually known as the city love guy. So I've written 4 books about urban issues, about love and emotional engagement with places, and why it's a good thing for people to fall in love with their cities. And those have been taking me all around the world, doing talks and workshops and lectures. And that's sort of my day job. It's a pretty cool day job. It's a little bit different. And I'm actually originally I'm a lawyer by training. I ask people not to hold that against me. I only practiced for a couple of years. But I found that the cities and the people who do amazing things in cities were something that really moved me, and it was their stories that I kind of wanted to tell, and that's what sort of started me on the path of being an author.
Okay. Well, a city person and one who really enjoys it and works it into your work.
Yeah.
Interesting. And a lot of people romanticize about country and owning 100 acres and having cows and horses and stuff. But you're a city person through and through.
I'm a city person, but big cities and I mean small cities have their charm as well. I happen to live in I would call it a medium-sized city. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, about 250,000 people.
I know that
Uh,
city.
yeah, not a huge city, but big enough for most purposes.
It's a very nice city too. Well, you want to get straight to it? Talk about your series?
Sure. So I've written this series about a Japanese American private detective. It's historic fiction. It's set in San Francisco in the late 1950s. And sort of the origin of that character came from reading another book called Facing the Mountain by a guy named Daniel James Brown. And he wrote this book, nonfiction, about the Japanese American experience during World War II. And I am half Japanese, and my father was of that age. He was interned. He served during World War II, but like so many of his generation, he never talked about those experiences. So, I mean, I heard a little bit, I read some history, you learn stuff along the way, but it wasn't until I read Brown's book just a few years ago that it's like, oh my God, what an amazing background for a story. And that became the impetus for creating this character that now populates this series of books. A vet who served during World War II with the 442nd, which was the storied Japanese-American combat unit in the Army. Segregated unit, all Japanese-American soldiers, they had white officers. And they served in Europe during World War II, and they served with incredible distinction.
Wow.
And I thought, well, what would happen when those guys came home? What would be their story? And I settled on San Francisco because that was one of the epicenters of Japanese American culture. And I made him a private detective because, interesting things don't necessarily happen to accountants the same way that they do with private detectives. Forgive me for that sort of classic trope, as it were. But setting it in San Francisco was important, and the timing was kind of interesting because late 50s and into the 60s, there was fascinating things going on in San Francisco. And I thought this is a really interesting backdrop to sort of write against.
And the name of that book?
First book is called Hunter's Point, which is actually a naval yard in San Francisco. It's sort of on the southeast side of San Francisco, just north of the airport. And it was historically the dumping ground for all the industrial and all the dirty industries of San Francisco. And a huge naval base was out there called Hunter's Point. During World War II, it was used extensively, even before that. And it eventually closes down in the 1970s, and it becomes a toxic site. It's called a Superfund site here in the States. And it's 1,000 acres of waterfront property that they can't do anything with because it is so environmentally damaged. They're still trying to figure that out.
Still, eh?
Yeah. Yeah. So figure how bad does something have to be if you can't make 1,000 acres of waterfront property in San Francisco work? It's pretty bad. Yeah.
Must be bad. I mean, the book cover is very interesting. It's got a
Oh,
broken
yes.
bridge there. What is that exactly?
Well, actually, yeah, I've got a copy here. This is actually the world's largest crane. It was used to lift battleship turrets in and out of ships at the time. And it's this iconic, it's kind of an iconic ruin there, because it's still visible as you're driving up the highway from the airport into the city. If you look to your right, you can see that crane. It sits at the end of this long pier. You can even see it from, I've seen it from the plane, both landing and taking off in San Francisco. It's that big. And again, it is a ruin, like most of that, that entire base. There's still a lot of buildings there, a lot of broken windows, and a lot of, chain link fence with a lot of keep out signs there. But the crane itself, iconic. And I thought that would be an apropos image for the first book. And anyone who knows that neighborhood or knows that goes, yeah, I've seen that crane.
I like the font too.
Oh,
Hunter's
thank
Crane
you.
font.
Yes, that's a kind of a fun one, kind of a noir font. It's kind of a noir book, so it seemed
Hmm.
appropriate.
And how long would that book be? How many pages?
360 pages,
Okay,
about
it's a fairly
95,000
hefty read. Yeah,
words.
yeah.
Yeah, I think, they say, certain genres have a certain average word count. I think maybe I'm a little higher than most for, mystery, historic fiction. But I don't want to rush telling something.
No.
It's like, all right, a little more meat on the bone, maybe.
Yeah. How did that work with the editor, being that it's your first fiction book?
It was pretty, it was good. There was not a whole lot of rewriting. There was a lot of technical sort of things like, okay, the rules of grammar and how you present when I'm writing nonfiction versus writing fiction. It's like, okay, there's a lot of things that you have to unlearn. But overall, it was a very smooth process, especially for somebody, a first-time fiction writer. Never had to go back for major rewrites, and yeah, I knock on wood, it was a very smooth process. Even the second one was very much like that.
Okay.
Third one's proven to be a little bit different, but it's every child is different, they say, right?
Yes,
So
that's right. That's right.
yeah.
So after you finished writing this book, did you know you were going to do a series?
I did. I fell in love with these characters. It's not just the main character's name is Katsuhiro Takamoto, and he's an amalgam actually he's an amalgam of several people, but he's named after my dad's two best friends from that era. Actually, guys he was in camp with. My father was interned in the American internment camp in Topaz, Utah. And his two best friends were named Peter Matsumoto and Masa Takatoshi. So I took their last names, Takatoshi, Matsumoto, Takemoto, and hence that became my character,
Yeah.
Katsuhiro Takamoto. And again, I fell in love with writing these characters. The female lead in the first book is kind of based on my own mother. My mom was a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. The character Molly, which is also my mother's name, is a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio who finds her way west, meets up with cats, and shenanigans happen.
Okay.
And it was just a fun read, or fun write. I hope it's a fun read for folks as well.
Great. I went from nonfiction to fiction myself, and I fell in love with my characters as well. I was
Yeah.
surprised to, that I saw a little bit of me and people
Oh,
I
of course.
know. I wasn't even intending to do that, and you're expressing that too. Bit of a
Oh, yeah.
surprise, isn't it? You find out about yourself more.
Yeah, I mean, they say write what you know, and who said that every character is usually a little bit of the author? Well,
Yeah.
that's absolutely true, because you're using your own experiences, and certainly I was using some of a little bit of my own father in there, and there's actually some very significant familial moments in the book that are absolutely that just come literally right from my family's history. So it was a way for me to reconnect with my father, who's been passed for 20 years. But I felt very close. I feel closer to him after writing these books, because I now sort of put myself into his shoes of what it must have been like as a young man, in the 1940s, and then moving forward and becoming an adult, and sort of navigating this kind of interesting shift in time, especially in San Francisco. San Francisco is seen as this very liberal, progressive city these days. But in the late 50s, it was not necessarily the case. So there was still a lot of prejudice, there was still a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans. And the fact that the characters are an Asian man and a white woman together was still pretty transgressive at the time.
I
And
bet.
my own parents got together in the early 60s in Ohio. And again, transgressive is an interesting, word to use, because it was not something that people saw a lot.
Okay.
There was the whole war bride syndrome. So you see a lot of times you'd see Caucasian men with Asian women, but
Yeah.
flip that around, and that was a different story. And
Yeah.
so that's integrated into this particular book.
Fascinating. So when you set out to write Hunter's Point, you didn't think you were going to write any books after that about the same subject.
Not necessarily,
Oh.
and in fact, when I set out to write it, I thought it was going to, I thought the backdrop was going to be the movie Vertigo. Big
Mhm.
fan of Hitchcock and the
Yeah,
movie
back
Vertigo.
in the
Filmed
font.
in San
Yeah,
Francisco, of course,
that's
in
what.
1957. And that was sort of the beginning of my research. And I thought, well, what if, Katz, as a private detective, was working on this with Jimmy Stewart, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And it evolved beyond that. Stewart is in the book and he plays a pretty critical role in the story, but Vertigo is a small piece of that
Okay.
there. Yeah, well, you're a writer. You know that, you start out writing something
Yeah,
and the characters and the narrative takes you someplace. I didn't know it was going to go there, but happy
exactly.
it did. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's in fiction it'll do that because it can go anywhere you really want to. Still has to make sense, but when you're writing nonfiction, you got to stick to the facts.
Yes, there's a certain protocol that goes with that. So,
Yeah.
but yes, follow the characters. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, next book, what is that one called? Let's see.
Midnight Climax. This one here. Provocative title. I know some of my friends kind of raise their eyebrows at that. Go, what are you writing erotica now? I said, well, not quite yet.
Now that is
Yeah,
a bridge. That's the Golden Gate Bridge, I bet.
that is the Golden Gate
Right.
Bridge.
Okay.
Same artist. I was very happy with the work he did, and so we wanted to stylize that. But the title actually comes from an actual CIA operation that occurred in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Some people may know about there was a project called it's called MK Ultra, that the CIA, in conjunction with the U.S. government, was doing experiments regarding mind control. Believe it or not, using psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, all of that kind of stuff to try to get people's get to again control their minds. They're using it as truth serum, all that. Well, a subset of that program was actually using prostitutes and CIA-controlled brothels, where the prostitutes would lure men in, they would dose them unbeknownst to them, and then they would get them to try to do things and observe them. So they're kind of human guinea pigs there. And it occurred in two U.S. cities. It occurred in New York and in San Francisco. And when I read this, I thought, oh my God, I have got to write a story with that as the background because no one is going to believe that really that happens. Like, yeah, really that happened.
Hmm.
And again, it's called Operation Midnight Climax.
Okay, so how do the characters transition from the end of book one to book two, or do they?
Yeah, it takes place a little over a year later. Katz and Molly are still together. His best friend is a gentleman named Shig Morau, who was a real guy, who was actually, as a writer, and many of our people may be watching this, you might know City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco, very famous independent bookstore.
Hmm.
Shig was the longtime manager of City Lights from like the mid 1950s up until through into the 1970s, actually. And Shig was a Japanese American. And it's like, okay, this would make sense that he was like the same age as my character Katz. And I made the two of them best friends. So there's a link, there's an anchor into the real sort of literary, the beat renaissance that was going on there in the 1950s and into the 60s. And he's a nice counterbalance to Katz, who was a soldier. She was also in the army as well, but he didn't, he wasn't that same kind of guy. He's more of an intellectual. He's a thinker, and he balances that out. So we meet them. So the first book ends, and again, about a little over a year later, they're still together. And they're still learning each other. It's a slow relationship. I think they're not living together yet, but they're trying to figure it out as a mixed race couple in a big city, and trying to figure out what they're going to become. I picture Molly, the character. She becomes the entertainment manager at an actually a well-known venue there in San Francisco, and I have this vision of her maybe eventually working for Bill Graham somewhere in the future, the famous music
Music promoter, yeah.
yeah, in San
Fillmore
Francisco.
West, I guess it would be called.
The Fillmore West was the one, and the Fillmore Theater. I was actually just there a few months ago doing some research. So yeah, I've got the next 5-7 years kind of mapped out.
Okay,
Just got to figure out, it's like finding the time to put it all,
sure.
pen to paper, as it were.
Mhm. I was thinking while you were talking that I was going to ask you, may as well do it.
Hmm.
What year is this taking place in?
First book takes place at the very beginning of 1958. The second book is in 1959. So we're on
Okay.
the cusp of the
The
1960s.
hippies. Yeah.
Yeah, the hippies are coming, right? In
Yep.
the late 50s and early 60s, it was more the beatniks,
Yes.
where they're sort of proto hippies,
Are
as
you
they were.
going to make it into Haight-Ashbury eventually?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I've
That should
already
be
done some
fun.
research, found out some fascinating little tidbits that will, of course, have to be in, those stories. But yes, so, and again, the backdrop of this is the Cold War. I mean, this is the height of the Cold War.
Yeah.
McCarthyism has sort of faded. He had his moment in the mid to later in 1950s, but that sort of mentality still exists. And in fact, in the first book, I even mentioned the launch of Sputnik, in late 1957, sets off an uproar in the US.
It
And
did.
it
Yeah.
scared the hell out of people because all of a sudden now the Russians beat us into space by a couple of months. And that really scared a lot of folks, including our government and our military.
Yeah.
So that's yes, we're dealing with beatniks, but we're also dealing with the Cold War and sort of that mentality at the same time. I will say this, that one of the things that I'm starting to explore more, especially into the second book, is the guys who came back from some really heavy combat. They didn't call it PTSD back then. They called it shell shock and battle fatigue, and they didn't really understand it. But
Mhm.
those things leave scars. And, Katz is incredibly well adjusted in some ways, but he is definitely suffering from PTSD. And we begin to explore that a bit in the second book, trying to understand sort of what he goes through. I mean, yeah, he wins a medal for bravery, but at a pretty significant personal cost that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that he still carries those scars with him, moving forward.
Yeah. Well, they sound like wonderful stories, and I was going to. I don't think I need to elaborate, but I'll mention what I was thinking. I was wondering where the conflicts take place. But since he's a private detective, there's all kinds of different things he gets involved in. Without
Yeah.
giving the story away, do we see Cats going through following various stories that are connected to the overall plot, or are they just adventurous things that he gets himself involved in?
Yeah, I try not to run down too many rabbit holes, with that. The way I sort of envision Cats is, we have these notions of like these hard-boiled San Francisco noir detectives. Sam Spade comes to mind.
Hmm.
Um, the idea was I don't want to do Sam Spade again. I want to do Katz, who has a sense of humor. He's incredibly capable. He doesn't like carrying a gun, and that's a function of sort of his experience and a little bit of the PTSD. Um, so I wanted to make him sort of not Sam Spade, but he will joke about. Of course, everyone thinks he's a private detective like Sam Spade. But I
Hmm.
also imagine that there was a time when, if you were in a minority, you probably didn't get a whole lot of attention from traditional, like a private detective. You probably didn't get much positive attention, maybe even from the police department. We even hear
Hmm.
that, continuing today. So Katz recognizes that there is an underserved community there in his city, and that becomes sort of his cause, that he wants to help these people who maybe don't get as much, don't get the attention of the authorities or of a traditional private detective.
Okay. Is he successful?
I think so. He solves a couple of these, and he keeps it together. The bad guys don't get away with it. I say early on that Katz doesn't like bullies. He doesn't like people who try to get over on other folks, and that sort of offends his sensibility. And a lot of times criminals think they can get over on somebody, or there's power that is being exercised on perceptibly weaker people. And that becomes sort of that's actually one of the key things in sort of the first story, that there's a small group of folks who are trying to hold out from this corporate entity that is trying to buy up their property in the Bayview Heights area, which is where the Hunters Point Naval Yard is. And they're doing it for some nefarious reasons, of course. And Katz, tries to help this group of folks who don't want to sell, and with for very good reasons. And they happen to be immigrants from Malta,
Okay.
which, because believe it or not, there is a Maltese community there in Bayview Heights, or historically there was.
Yeah.
Italians, Maltese, African Americans, Chinese. Again, this is one area where, you were, a person of color or an immigrant, you could buy land there. There weren't all that many places where those folks could actually buy land. Bayview Heights around Hunters Point was one of those places.
Hmm. When one is writing historical fiction, like how you've taken it on, you must have done a lot of research as to the language and the way people express themselves
Yeah.
and the things that were happening around. Certainly, television was not in its
Yeah.
infancy, but it wasn't that big thing, and
Yeah.
telephones were still hooked to, you had to go to a telephone booth, and there were no
Yes.
computers, so you had to think about all those things, right?
You do. And what's funny is you have to, I mean, we're old enough to remember when, the landlines and all of that. So instantaneous communication, which you can, now if you're writing modern fiction, it's like, oh, you can immediately contact somebody with, oh my God, get out of the building, there's a bomb. It's like, well, no, it's like you'd have to call and hopefully they were home. And yeah, there's not even an answering machine. So yes, there are limitations around that. So you have to put yourself into that time frame. And that, again, I think that's becomes a function of doing, the research, understanding the limits of the technology. But at heart, you're still trying to tell, human stories. We haven't changed that much just because of, cell phones and computers. We're now, I think the instantaneous nature of communications has certainly changed. But the fundamental messaging and the way human beings react and the way we want to interact with each other, I think is still the same.
Hmm. There was a war in Korea at the time, and then eventually
Yeah,
that never actually ended. It's still, still a war.
sure.
And
Partitioned.
then
Yep.
that policed action that we call Vietnam War is
Yeah.
taking place by 59. I think America was already involved.
We had
How
some,
does
yeah.
how does
What's that?
Katz feel about that going on?
The interesting thing is, in the second book, we meet a character who was a soldier in Korea, and he was captured and he was actually experimented upon using. You remember the Manchurian Candidate, that
Yes,
old movie with Frank
yeah,
Sinatra,
sure.
remade with Denzel Washington. Good movies there.
Hmm.
But so we use that as the backdrop. The Korean War, I guess, ended. Well, shooting stopped in 1953. As you point out, there's still sort of an ongoing conflict. Shooting stopped in 1953. And one of the characters in the second book, Midnight Climax, is kind of a victim of these experiments, and it's done some really strange and some crazy things to him. What's interesting, as you point out, the Vietnam War is looming, and we actually mention that a little bit, where a criminal agency or a criminal organization is mentioning the fact that they're using drugs to fund the war in Southeast Asia. And we have a character who happens to be in the special forces. And this is all, it's like, yeah, he knows there's a coming conflict there. And of course, readers will know, anyone who understands a little bit of, that history, it's like, of course, the Vietnam War is looming. But we're sort of in this weird time period between, it's the Eisenhower presidency, the tail end of that. It's the American dream, a car and two kids in the,
Golden
and
age of economic expansion.
oh yeah, it was the golden age in many ways. Not necessarily for all the folks, who maybe look like cats, but
That's right.
there was an optimism in the
Yeah.
country, despite sort of this backdrop of the
Hmm.
Cold War and the fear. But I think readers will know, it's like, yeah, there's some very tough times coming. There's some very interesting times coming, of course, in the 1960s, especially in a place like San Francisco. And like I said, I kind of can't wait to get to some of those
Yeah,
stories.
I bet. I bet. If someone's getting into these novels and they know there's more coming and they know
Oh yeah.
how are you going to approach the 60s? How old is Katz by this point in time? If you know.
In the first book, he's 33.
All
He was
right.
born in 1924. And I did sort of the math because I wanted him to be able, when he turned 18, he would have been in an internment camp. I have him set in Minidoka, which was in Idaho. I wanted to, like many of those folks, he becomes 18, he becomes eligible to enlist. And of course, like so many of the Japanese American young men in camp, they enlisted. They wanted to prove themselves. So I thought it was very important for Katz to be amongst the first to actually enlist and get over there. So by the time we meet him, he's like 33 years old there in 1958. So yeah, he would have been 18 in 44. So
Hmm.
43, he could
Yeah.
enlist. Yeah.
So you could you can take him into his 60s, into the early 80s. There's all kinds
Absolutely.
of things that happened between 59 and 84.
Absolutely. It's like,
Uh,
I still enjoy writing. If people are still interested in reading them, I'd be more than happy to, take cats into the 1970s. Maybe you could meet Harvey Milk at some point, um, in the 1970s there in San Francisco.
Interesting. Wonderful. Now, you transitioned from a nonfiction writer, we made references to that earlier, to a fiction
Yeah.
writer. What was that like for you?
It was an accident. It was a COVID project.
Oh,
So the second year of sort of lockdown, and we weren't traveling, weren't doing a whole lot. I actually did the 10-year anniversary edition of my first nonfiction book about cities. It's called For the Love of Cities. The 10-year anniversary edition is called For the Love of Cities Revisited. The revised one is interesting because it has almost all the original content, but I actually went through and I did almost like a director's commentary. So I kept most of the original book, and then I called out certain things like, here's where I was right about something, here's where I was wrong, here's where it's still an ongoing sort of thing. And it was interesting to go back and read your own stuff and to think about your own stuff of where you were sort of 10 years before. So it's like this one and then this one.
mhm.
So again, most of all this content is still in here, but now it's with a little bit of hindsight added to it. And that was really fun to do. And then when that was done, it's like, that was when I read that book by that gentleman named Brown about facing the mountain. And I just had this kind of weird urge, like maybe I started writing a couple chapters, and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my wife. She didn't know about this. And about 4 chapters in, I'm like excited about this. And I gave it to her. I says, I think I'm onto something here. And she was very encouraging with that. And she's been incredibly encouraging all the way through. In fact, she did all the illustrations in here. Each of the books has a dozen or so pen and ink illustrations, mostly of the scenery that we're talking about. My wife is an architect, and she's a classically trained
Oh,
architect who can still draw.
okay.
So she did some amazing line artwork for me that I think helps people understand. If
That's
you've never
great.
been to San Francisco, you look at it, oh, I kind of get that. So yeah,
That's
so
great.
yeah, it was a COVID project.
Okay.
Some people learned the language, some people, got back in shape. I transitioned into fiction.
So you
Go
thought
figure.
fiction, and the first thing that came to your mind was this idea that based on your background and who your father
Yeah,
was, and then you just elaborated on that.
it was. I think again, the timing. Having finished that book about the Japanese American experience and being in that sort of mode of thinking of in a writing mode, I guess in some ways it's a happy accident.
Hmm.
Um, God bless, the happy accidents.
Have you got any relatives who are alive? I know you said your father passed away.
Yes,
That knows
my
that you're doing this.
my cousins. So my dad had two older sisters. So my cousins have they are aware of this. And in fact, I mentioned sort of their mother's names are in our cat, the names of Kat's two older sisters.
Hmm.
And the story of my grandparents, so all of our collective grandparents, it's actually based on exactly sort of what happened to them. They went back to my grandparents went back to Japan in the 1950s. My grandfather, apparently that loss of station and just is really challenging for him. And so they eventually go back to Japan after having immigrated here in the 1920s.
Hmm.
And so my cousins have been really supportive of this. And in fact, they've come up with this, oh, by the way, you remember this story? It's like, no, I never heard that story. So it's been a way for us to sort of spark a dialogue about our sort of collective family history.
Cool. Oh, cool. I like it. I'm gonna flip over to something I saw earlier. One of your books really caught my attention, and I'll tell you why. I lived in Toronto for 40 years. I told you in pre-chat, and then
Yeah.
things happened, and I couldn't stay there, and I moved to the small town here in Nova Scotia. Bit of a
Yeah.
culture shock, not the end of the world, but I wasn't really sure whether I liked it or not. And here you
Hmm.
got a book called Love Where You Live. If I would have
Yeah.
seen that in the bookshop here, I would have bought it just because of the title alone. What are you trying to
Oh,
say with
okay.
that book?
That was the second book. That was the one that came after For the Love of Cities. And what it was, I call that book sort of a how-to manual because I think that book came out in 2015. So I've been on the road for several years doing talks. And whenever I go to a place, usually, I'll be brought in by a city or a chamber of commerce or an economic development organization. Of course, they want to show me around. They want to show me the things that they're proud of. And I started seeing lots of really interesting examples of this emotional connection with places. And so the second book became sort of a collection of those stories, those examples. So Love Where You Live, it's relatively short, and it'd be ways for somebody to realize, wow, that's cool. We can do something like that here. Or maybe it sparks their imagination and gets them thinking about the role that everyday citizens can play in placemaking. Most people think placemaking is somebody else's job. It's like the mayor and, city council and all that. Well, that's true. They do have a pretty powerful position. But you and I, if we decide we want to get involved, there's ways that we can express that. And there's ways that we can really make a difference in our own community. And that was what I wanted to tell, especially with that particular book.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, Windsor, Nova Scotia is the birthplace of hockey.
Well, there you go.
Just
Well,
so you
look
know.
at, I mean, Canada is forever grateful for that.
Yeah, I
You know,
guess so. The whole
yeah,
world. Yeah.
the whole world. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a website?
I do. You can go to peterkageyama.com. That's Kageyama. There's a lot of interesting things. There's some behind the story. One of the things that I'm really interested in is history. And of course, you don't want to have too much exposition in the book about the history, but you might include it in the endnotes. See a lot of the sketches that my wife did and explaining a little bit more about her process and what those were. Yeah, so peterkageyama.com.
Well, Peter, let's get back to this series that you're writing. I'm going
Yeah.
to put you full frame, and this is going to be your pitch to tell people why they should buy these books.
So uh, I'm a big believer in the power of stories. Stories can change the way people think about a place. They can change the way people think about people, events. And great stories are all over the place. A lot of times they're just not necessarily well known. And one of the missing parts in, I think, certainly in American history, and this is probably true for all over the world, is there was a time period when the United States did something very, very wrong to the Japanese Americans who were its citizens. It's a story that's not told in schools. It's not very well known, but that had an incredible impact on those people. It had an incredible impact on my family. And for the most part, they weathered it with incredible dignity. And they used that as a springboard to becoming really, really good parents, good citizens, good workers. And I wanted to use that as sort of the backdrop for this character because I thought it was important to tell the story of Japanese Americans in the United States after World War II, and to use that history to tell a really good story and to tell a little bit about our collective history that maybe hasn't been as widely publicized or as widely disseminated as it probably should. It's an interesting background. It's a fun background in some ways because I'm able to use some Vertigo, Jimmy Stewart, Jack Kerouac all make appearances in the first book. As a fan of all of that, I wanted to make sure that was done in a really positive way that it gets people excited about
Excellent.
our history.
Excellent. When do you think your third book's coming out?
I'm shooting for early next year. I've been pretty good about January seems to be a nice date to launch books. It may or may not happen. There's some stuff going on. My wife and I are in the process of moving, so that of course is kind of disruptive. But I'm working on book 3 right now. I'm
Great.
pretty excited about it. Can I tease that?
Go right ahead. Yeah.
So Nazi gold. So I've done a lot of research about that. Nazi gold and plundered art. Fascinating stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
what's going to be
gonna
in the
delve a
book,
little
eh?
bit
Oh, okay.
back into World War II.
All right. Okay. Sounds really good. And when you do get that out, have your publicist contact me and we'll get you
I
back on the
absolutely
show
will.
and we'll talk some more about that because I think this is a great series. Really, really,
Thank you.
really I do.
Much appreciated, John. Thank you
All
for
right.
your time as well.
Well, it was great talking to you, Peter.
You too. Stay warm and keep writing too.
All right. You take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then please consider hitting that like button and leaving a comment. You can also subscribe and ring that bell because I release 2 episodes per week, one on Wednesdays and one on Saturdays. And if you are an author, I would love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.